Thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Ed Carley. I'm the Senior Program Director for the National Association of State Energy Officials Building Program. I wanted to just cover some quick housekeeping stuff, but first of all, welcome everyone and thank you for joining this webinar today. Housekeeping. This is a Zoom meeting rather than a webinar. It's possible for you to inadvertently unmute yourself. I will be watching that and muting anyone who needs to be muted, but you will also have the opportunity to raise your hand and ask questions. You can also submit questions using the chat function down in the menu bar on Zoom here. And most of that Q&A we're going to save till the end, but we may work in a couple of questions along the way if there are things that we think will be pressing and can contribute or clarify any sort of technical points along the way. The webinar today is going to explore how utility data access unlocks a variety of policy and program opportunities. We've got speakers today from the Washington, D.C. Department of Energy and Environment, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the Institute for Market Transformation, the U.S. Department of Energy, State Office of State and Community Energy Programs, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And they'll be talking about how utility data access can support state goals and federal programs. We also hope that utility data access will be something that those of you who are listening in from the state energy offices will consider as you work on your climate pollution reduction grant planning activities. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Joanna. I will pull up your slides in just a moment here.
Thanks, Ed. And hi, everyone. My name is Joanna Saunders. I'm with the District Department of Energy and Environment, so local Washington, D.C. Entity, not quite a city, not quite a state. We're somewhere in that fun part in between. But we have been operating an energy benchmarking program for closing in on a decade this year. And also a number of years ago at this point, passed the nation's first building energy performance standards program. So wanted to give a high-level overview of our energy benchmarking and BEPS programs, and of course, importantly, how whole building utility data access is absolutely crucial to the effectiveness of those programs. You can go to the next slide, Ed. So high-level basic facts about energy benchmarking. The law was originally passed back in 2008. It was the Clean and Affordable Energy Act. And that is what established the initial energy benchmarking requirements. Since then, there have been other acts that have passed that have expanded the initial Clean and Affordable Energy Act to cover a greater number of buildings. Energy benchmarking program and enforcement and actual real regulatory authority took place starting in 2012. So we've really been implementing the program since 2012, with it becoming more rigorous in 2014. Currently, all privately owned buildings over 25,000 square feet are required to report their annual energy and water use to the district, as well as all public DC-owned buildings over 10,000 square feet. The annual reporting deadline is April 1st of every year, and all reporting is done through the US EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool. There is, of course, an enforcement aspect as well. Our regulations give us the authority to fine buildings up to $100 a day that every day a building is not in compliance following that April 1 deadline. And relevant to this webinar, our program was really strengthened by the passing of the Sustainable DC Omnibus Amendment Act of 2014, which explicitly required our local utilities, which are Pepco and Washington Gas, our electric and gas utilities respectively, to provide building owners with monthly aggregate whole building data and up to 2 years of historic data from the date of request. Next slide. So what is whole building energy data? When we talk about whole building energy data, we're talking about the energy data for the entire property, which include retail, tenant, common area spaces, anything and everything that might be using energy within the confines of the building. And it really depends on the setup for each building. In many cases, there is just one singular electric and or gas meter that services the entirety of the property, or there might be a combination of these house or common area meters along with individual tenant meters. And there is, of course, always a difference between, are there just electric meters that are in individual units, gas meters, combination of both. And so with the passing of the Sustainable DC Amendment Act of 2014, required that if a building has 5 or more electric or natural gas meters, it can request aggregate whole building data directly from the utilities. And this allows the energy data to be protected. The privacy of individual tenants is never, their consumption data is never known, while still allowing building owners to report the total energy consumption at their property. That data can be automatically uploaded into Portfolio Manager every month. Both our utilities, Pepco and Washington Gas, have web services connections between their respective platforms and Portfolio Manager, so that once a building owner gets set up, they don't have to worry about manually entering data. It will be automatically uploaded at the very minimum every 45 days as required by the law. And as I mentioned, historic data can be requested up to 2 years prior. So there are cases where a building has just dropped the ball, or there was a couple of years of non-compliance, new management, new ownership, and they're not really sure how to catch up. Thankfully, if they have 5 or more meters, they can request historic data back to 2 years from Pepco and Washington Gas. Next slide. So what did we learn from the last 10 years of gathering this annual energy and water data? Well, we learned that the majority of our energy use and emissions in the District of Columbia are coming directly from our buildings. This graph shows that around 70% of our total greenhouse gas emissions are coming from buildings, whether it be commercial, industrial, or government buildings and residential buildings. So when it came to planning how we are eventually going to be carbon-free by 2045 and also hitting more interim goals such as a 60% reduction in emissions by 2032, it was pretty clear that buildings had to be a big part of our climate policy package. Next slide. So in early 2019, the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Amendment Act of 2018 was signed into law, which required the establishment of a minimum threshold for energy performance that will be no lower than the local median Energy Star score by property type or an equivalent metric. This law also established that these standards will be set every 6 years, though that we are in our first BEP cycle currently, and there is a 1-year adjustment due to the COVID-19 pandemic. All of the data that we used to set these building energy performance standards are based on the benchmarking data that we received. We used a 2019 baseline, and we will be using a 2026 benchmarking data to evaluate whether or not buildings have actually come into compliance with BEPS and met their required energy reductions throughout their compliance period. So, of course, having robust data, having access to whole building data, it's absolutely crucial for us to be able to push forward a program such as BEPS. Otherwise, we would have no way of actually measuring how these buildings are actually performing, and therefore how those buildings need to improve their efficiency over time. I think there's just one more slide. And this shows how BEPS applies over time. We are in our current first BEPS cycle, which only applies to private buildings over 50,000 square feet and DC-owned public buildings over 10,000 square feet. However, in subsequent cycles, that size threshold will drop. So the next one will start covering buildings over 25,000 square feet. And then finally, all buildings in the district that are public and privately owned over 10,000 square feet will be subject to BEPS. And the reason that whole building energy data is so important, especially as we start to ratchet down our building size, is when you look at the stock of buildings that are over 50,000 square feet, it's about a third that are residential, and it's predominantly our residential multifamily buildings that require whole building data directly from utilities, as they are the most likely to have 5 or more individually metered tenants in their building. When looking at the next threshold drop down, so those 25 to 50,000 square feet, that percentage of residential buildings increases to just over 50%. And then when you drop down to 10,000 square feet, the 10 to 25 range has over 60% of those buildings that are residential. So it has always been important that our buildings are able to access whole building energy data from the utilities, but moving forward, especially with the implementation of BEPS and the size threshold dropping down, it becomes more and more important. The last thing I'll say is that, we've had this law in place for quite a while. It's been 10 years since the Sustainable DC Amendment Act of 2014 passed. And it wasn't super detailed. It wasn't very prescriptive. It really just said that these utilities needed to have an online platform. They needed to provide data at least every 45 days in an easy to access online platform, and that they needed to be able to provide data back 2 years from the date of request. We've definitely seen our fair share of challenges with our utilities being able to provide reliable and timely data. Some of the platforms have been a bit clunky and difficult to use, but I would say more to the point is we've seen some challenges in the way that our utilities are actually mapping their meters and placing the requirement of actually going and finding the meters on the property on the building owners. So it's something to consider as different jurisdictions are thinking about adopting these utility laws. Are there ways to better integrate the actual process by which building owners could request this data? As we found, one of the biggest challenges in implementing our benchmarking and BEPS programs is getting building owners on site, physically writing down their meter numbers and then requesting that data from our utilities, which, as you might guess, could lead to a lot of miswriting of numbers, missing of meters, and potentially impacting the integrity and completeness of the data being reported. But with that, I'm done with my introduction, and we can introduce the rest of our panelists. So with us today, as Ed mentioned, we're lucky to have some folks from a number of different institutions who are really well suited to speak on this topic. We have Brendan Hall, who is a policy analyst in the Energy Star Commercial Buildings Program from the U.S. Environment Protection Agency. We have Cliff Majerzik, who is a senior advisor at the Institute for Market Transformation. We have Lauren Ross, who is a senior technical advisor of multifamily building energy efficiency for the U.S. Department of Energy. And we have Jen Larson, who's the director of multifamily asset management and portfolio oversight at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Brendan Hall.
Everyone, and I think, Ed, you'll help me load up slides. Yes, thank you. That was very slick. So good afternoon. I'm Brendan Hall, as Joanna said, and my role with the program at EPA is working with state and local governments in the implementation of their existing building-focused programs and policies. And just want to cover a little bit today about how EPA is working in this space on whole building energy data. So next slide. All right, so I'm going to cover these topics today, starting with sort of why building owners need this data, why it's particularly valuable to them. And you can go to the next slide. So at its core, this data is important because the building is the most meaningful level at which to assess performance and understand opportunities for improvement. So not part of the building like common area only, not the utility meter level or utility account level, but the entire building. And there are a number of, and growing number of programs and policies that sort of reflect that belief that energy performance should be assessed at a building level. That can include sort of mandatory state and local reporting, like the program Joanna was mentioning, mandatory of a different stripe, like corporate or investor reporting, voluntary tracking of energy use and performance, along with pursuit of, recognition like EPA Energy Star certification for eligible buildings. Shameless plug there, but and that can go all the way down to accessing incentives for efficiency projects. And I highlighted on this slide a couple of new examples where buildings can get money for efficiency and energy projects. And HUD and DOE are on to talk about their programs. So I'll just mention the expanded 179D tax deduction, which offers an incentive for projects based on a percent improvement in whole building performance, up to $5 a square foot. So a pretty significant incentive, and building owners will potentially miss out on that incentive if they don't have access to this whole building data, since that's what it's based on. And getting this data through other means besides utility sort of provision can be impractical or very expensive for building owners. So getting individual consents from all the tenants in a building, or installing sort of shadow meters, across an entire building portfolio, which would be very expensive. So this utility route of providing this whole building data is a lot easier and less expensive, sort of in some, while still ensuring the privacy of that tenant data. You can go to the next slide. So what does EPA offer in this space? Well, we created, first off, this document to articulate the need for this data in the context of these new incentives. And I just wanted to highlight one focus of the document, which is to ensure that building owners that need these resources most from an equity perspective can tap into them. So we want to make sure that the benefits of these incentive programs don't flow just to certain building owners or certain communities, but the building owners, the tenants and occupants of those buildings, and the communities that they're located in, where those resources are needed most, that's where they should go. So next slide. Another long-standing EPA resource you hopefully are aware of is this interactive map that EPA maintains that shows the utilities that are currently offering this data in the US. So there are about 75 of those utilities right now. Some of those deliver data on an automated basis, so their systems directly connect to Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Some deliver data via a spreadsheet format. Some of the solutions aren't aggregated or whole buildings, they're just sort of disaggregated, an individual account or meter data gets sent over. But anyway, together, these utilities represent about a quarter of the buildings that are benchmarked in Energy Star Portfolio Manager as of 2022. So it's a pretty significant sort of group of buildings that are using these services. But the kicker is that this data isn't available, like as you can see on the map, to building owners in most of the country. So all, multifamily, multi-tenant office, warehouse buildings, they're all sort of missing access to this data. Next slide. Okay, and I'm not going to obviously go through each of these individual bullets, but I wanted to highlight the other resource besides the map that we have, which we finalized in 2023, which is our guidance for utilities. And it's based on best practices we see among the states that are requiring utilities to offer this data and the utilities that are offering it voluntarily. And they focus especially on sort of data accuracy and ease of use of the data, including providing a receipt of the meters that are used when aggregated data is delivered. So, sort of an accounting or audit trail or something of which meters are adding up to that total, so that there's a way to verify the accuracy. Okay, next slide. And then last couple slides here, EPA is exploring a campaign to help building owners make the case to decision makers on why they need this data, both states and utilities. And I listed some reasons on why we think this makes sense and makes sense now, starting with the fact that customer demand is a powerful signal. So, EPA Energy Star, is a voluntary program. We don't have so much sort of voice with individual utilities, whereas, large building owner customers, we think do. And so, centering their sort of demands for this data, we think will be more effective than us just like sort of talking like on this webinar today. There's these new incentives that we think are a rallying point. There's money on the table that building owners might not be able to access without this data. And then there's sort of these two sort of foundational things from our perspective: this guidance that EPA finalized last year, and then model state law that IMT and RAP recently published. And I think Cliff's going to talk more about that model law. All right, so next slide. I think I'm almost done here. So this campaign, as proposed, would start with collecting testimonials from building owners on where they need this data most and why they need this data. So it's really focused, on getting those sort of stories from building owners first. And then EPA would create an engagement toolkit, which is just a shorthand, we're calling it now, but it would include things like background on this issue, a form letter that building owners could use to send to decision makers, some testimonials probably highlighted from that exercise of gathering them, stuff like that. And the last part would be EPA would try to convene meetings with state and utility decision makers and interested building owners. So those are the three sort of components we're thinking about. I'm also always open to feedback and input, but just wanted to share that we're actively exploring that idea. Okay, last slide, I think. One more slide. Sorry, should have been more clear. So just had this slide here in case your state is interested in moving forward now. There are a number of things you could do today, from sort of actively reaching out and trying to support utilities in your state on a voluntary basis, or just broadly promoting sort of the need for this data. You could offer incentives, flow through incentives for utilities that offer this data, or you could move to require it, especially through engagement with your PUC or PSC. So there's a lot of things there that you could do, but just want to mention EPA is available to support you and interested utilities in your state if they want to talk more. So you can reach out there, and thank you for listening. I think I'm going on to Cliff.
Thanks, Brendan. Next up, we have Cliff Majerzik with the Institute of Market Transformation. So I'll pass it over to you, Cliff. Oh, you are muted.
Can you hear me now? Thank you. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share. Institute for Market Transformation is a nonprofit. We operate nationally. We work directly assisting states and localities in developing programs and policies to advance building energy performance as a way to help everyone, regardless where they live, work, or play, and fight climate change. And we have worked with the Regulatory Assistance Project to develop a model utility data access law. And this is a thumbnail of the front page of that law. And we developed it in response to requests from building owners, from policymakers, and others that needed access to this data for all the reasons that Brendan and Joanna had gone through, and even more so now than before, because there's billions of dollars of federal money that require whole building data in order for building owners to be able to access it. So we wrote the model law to be adopted at the state level because, of course, states regulate utilities. And we received critical input from the Energy Star program. It was published in 2023. It's a living document, so it will evolve over time as we learn from the experience of jurisdictions implementing disclosure laws. And it's available for free download at the address there. Now, in order to develop the model law, we took lessons learned from the many jurisdictions that have already adopted laws or rules that require utilities to provide this data. And we published a public comment version of the model law, circulated it broadly to real estate service providers, utilities, policymakers, tenants, social equity advocates, privacy advocates, and more. And we received comments from more than 40 associations, organizations, and companies on our draft. The draft benefited enormously from all of that input. And I think we've done a real good job of balancing the need for this data, but also the need to protect individual customer account privacy. And the good news is we can sort of have our cake and eat it too with the balances that have been put into this law. So the law requires utilities to share aggregated whole building consumption data with building owners, and also to digitally share data at the account holder's request. So this helps single family owners too. If I want to get solar on my home, the provider needs to know how much electricity I use to find out whether, how big they can size my solar panels, for instance. It's a lot easier if there's an automated process by which, in a standard form, by which the homeowner can share that data with the provider. So the main use case here is whole building data in a context of, say, an apartment building, which is critically important and needed to get all of these incentives. But there is also a lot of benefit that's available even to single homeowners or small businesses that operate and own their own small building. Now, the law starts by setting a lead agency, which will usually be the Public Utility Commission, but in certain cases, it may make sense for that to be the Energy Office, to write the rules, guided by a stakeholder process, so inclusive process. This is codifying the best practices that we've seen from the more than 70 utilities around the country that are providing whole building data access. You saw that map that was shared by Brendan. Of the utilities that are already doing this. The law only puts requirements on the utilities themselves and on the rule writers, which is, again, usually going to be the Public Utility Commission. And it provides data access only to the owners, landlords, and their designees. So there's no question of this data being made public. That's a totally separate matter for things like benchmarking and transparency laws. But this law is absolutely appropriate regardless of that. And that's why it's so strongly supported by building owners. Now, this covers all energy utilities, including, of course, electricity and gas, but also things like fuel oil and propane and district energy. And you can see district energy and utility are in all caps. In the model law, defined terms are in all caps. So I've just kept that there as one little example of how it looks. The main law just covers those energy utilities because usually getting access to whole building water data is less of an issue. Most buildings tend to be master metered for water, but there is a second version of the law that adds in water utilities, so it covers them as well. The law phases in over time. So large utilities are required to move faster, and they're required to upload data directly to Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Medium-sized utilities are given a little bit more time, and they can just provide the data in spreadsheets instead of having to upload directly. And then the law largely exempts smaller utilities, those utilities that have less than $10 million in annual revenue. They don't have to do almost anything that's here in the law. We don't want this to apply to sort of mom and pop utilities that are not what we think of when we generally think of utilities. It sets an aggregation threshold, and that aggregation threshold can be written into the law. And we provide suggested levels, and those are suggested in brackets, which means to say, we recommend you use these numbers, but your mileage will vary, and talk to your stakeholders to figure out what the exact number should be. So we recommend an aggregation threshold of 5 for residential buildings, and an aggregation of 3 accounts for all other buildings. So if you have a 3-tenant office building, that would meet the aggregation threshold. And individual tenants and individual condo or co-op owner accounts all count against those totals. So this is an important way for co-ops and condos to be able to get whole building data, since typically the owners of condos receive the utility bills directly. The law clarifies that this data, this aggregated data, is not confidential. It's not personally identifiable information, and it doesn't need to be treated as such. Unfortunately, even though this data is protective of privacy, we have seen situations where utilities have treated it as though it was personally identifiable, and that creates a burden on the utilities themselves, on building owners, and on others. So we want to make very clear this is not personally identifiable information. And then utilities can have their costs covered in providing access to this data. But prior to seeking cost recovery for providing access to this data, they have to demonstrate that they've made a good faith effort to secure federal, state, and other relevant funding. And that's important because there's a lot of money available in the Inflation Reduction Act for utilities that can be used for this purpose. So this is a great time for laws like this to be put in place. And only after they've shown that they have sought this funding can they go ahead and file for cost recovery and other reasonable and prudently incurred costs to provide the aggregated usage data. So this is we worked with utilities in developing this. We want to make sure that this is working for utilities. It's actually helping to provide some real clarity to utilities that have sometimes not had good guidance. And critically, this is leaning on utility regulators to typically be the lead, because the utilities we know are very responsive to utility regulators. As you all know from energy offices, utilities tend to be a little bit less responsive to their energy offices than to the folks who actually regulate them. So it's very important that the utility regulators be in the process and understand how important this data is, and that they actually need to engage in providing rules for the road, clarity, and protection from liability for utilities that are doing the right thing. So this is something that we hope that utilities will be very supportive of as well. And here is my contact information. And before I close off, I just want to seed the question, is this something that you all as states, as state energy offices, feel like could be useful? Are you interested in including this in your climate pollution reduction grant plans? Are you interested in working with legislators or with your PUCs to make this happen? And are there other ways that our groups, the Institute for Market Transformation, Regulatory Assistance Project, RAP, EPA, or others, could help you make that happen? So thanks again for giving me the opportunity to present, and I'll give it back to Joanna.
Thank you so much, Cliff. Next up, we have Lauren Ross from the U.S. Department of Energy. Lauren, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. And hi, everyone. As Joanna mentioned, I'm Lauren Ross. I'm Senior Technical Advisor for Multifamily in the Home Energy Rebates Program within the State and Community Energy Program at DOE. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak on this topic today. And, I feel like at this point, both Brendan, Cliff, and others have talked about the how. I'll be talking a little bit more about the why and how data access, whole building data access relates to the home energy rebates, and particularly the implications for multifamily building owners and tenants to benefit from these rebates. As many of you probably know at this point, the funding for home energy rebates will be issued to states based on a set formula. Although funding is allocated for states, territories, and tribes, they still have to apply to DOE to release the funding. And their intended program design and implementation have to meet several criteria, one of them being data access. So this topic is top of mind for many states right now. Next slide. And in case there are folks new to energy rebates on the call, I just wanted to provide at least one kind of overview slide. So in terms of the basics for the home energy rebates program, when we generally refer to the home energy rebates, we're referring to the $8.8 billion in home energy rebates to make electricity and efficiency upgrades more affordable for households across the country. These funds technically come from two provisions, one primarily focused on whole home energy efficiency retrofits, and the other focused on rebates for efficient electric technologies for low and moderate income households. And then together, we refer to these as the home energy rebates. So today we'll be discussing data access in the context of the home efficiency rebate. So in the context of the whole home energy efficiency rebate program. The efficiency program consists of two paths for estimating savings and determining the rebate levels. One is the modeled path, where a state or contractor runs a model to predict their a model to predict their energy savings. The equipment is then installed. The household is provided their rebate, and the savings are evaluated later. The other is referred to as the measured pathway, where energy use data is collected to set a baseline, equipment is installed, the household receives the rebate, and then a year later, the energy data is collected again, and the difference in savings is measured and reported. So those are the two kind of provisions of the home efficiency rebates. Next slide. And before kind of jumping into the meat, I just wanted to show the allocations here for states. The numbers presented here capture the total amount of rebate funding going to states. It's roughly split 50-50 between the home energy and electrification rebates. At a minimum, each state will be spending 10% of its rebate funding on multifamily, but that is really just the floor. And many states are hoping to spend much more than 10% on the multifamily sector. Next slide. So to get started, I want to just provide a little bit of clarity around the home energy rebates and the data access requirements associated with the rebates. I referred to the home efficiency rebates, both the measured and modeled paths. They do require energy consumption data be used to calculate energy savings and the associated rebate. Energy consumption in this context is the metered electricity or natural gas, which is used for utility billing. The other program, the electrification rebates, Section 50122 of the IRA, does not require access to energy consumption data. Second, consumption data is required for program needs during and or after homeowner or building owner participation, including implementation, reporting, and potentially evaluation purposes. These data are required to be collected and provided to DOE as part of DOE requirements and the underlying statute. Energy consumption data can also be used for marketing purposes, thinking about targeting high use buildings, to kind of create awareness of the program to target specific buildings. But the purpose of pre-program targeting is optional. I should say the purpose of using data for pre-program targeting is optional. And then lastly, states must collect utility consumption data if they are offering the measured program in single family or multifamily. So that applies to both, For the modeled approach, energy consumption data is required for single-family homes. States may request exceptions for multifamily, delivered fuels, adding cooling or occupancy of less than a year. That has to do with the guidance that we provide on modeling requirements. And so we're currently working with states now to kind of set a pathway for, at least for this audience, for the multifamily side. Next slide. So as I said, states are at a moment now of key decision points. And one part of that is thinking through what are the best options to collect utility bills. This slide is kind of my attempt to lay out the three different ways which we can go about, which states or their contractor can go about collecting utility bills. And you should really look at this list of options from easiest to hardest. And that's kind of what I'm just demonstrating in the arrow there on the right-hand side. But the states do have options here. So one, and what we've really focused on today, and what is certainly the easiest pathway when it comes to whole building data, is where there are utility agreements in place for the provision of whole building aggregate data via EPA's portfolio manager. Again, we're talking about utility data today. Whole building data today. So I'll focus on that use case. But that by far, having that already in place, starting to get that in place is the easiest, most automized way to share data from the utility to the contractor, or at least to the building owner who can release it to the contractor. And that goes back to all the kind of highlights from Brendan's talk. And then you have the option of collecting it directly from utilities. What this typically looks like, or has looked like in the past on behalf of utilities that don't rely on EPA portfolio manager or provide that as a service to customers, is think about a building owner requesting the aggregate data for all of their units. Maybe the utility would deliver it in a one-off way in a spreadsheet form. And then that would be up to the owner what they chose to do with that spreadsheet. They could upload it into Portfolio Manager too, but it's a little bit more clunkier. They have to, go through the utility themselves to get the data. And then there's collecting the data from residents and owners, which is, of course, the least desirable way. It's easier on the single family side for sure. And then sometimes there's cases where the residents can just share their login and contractors can retrieve their energy data. It's much more complicated when in individually metered multifamily buildings. You can imagine trying to collect that data from upwards of 100 of tenants is really time consuming and often a deal breaker for many multifamily building owners. But ultimately, that is the options that states and their contractors have for collecting utility bills. Next slide. So we at DOE right now are kind of in the process of helping states think through what this process looks like and what options they have at their disposal. And one was that, kind of quick overview I just gave you. And this is, I pulled this from a document we just released a little over a week ago that kind of charts out, let me take a step back. As part of the requirements for states to apply for the funding, they have to submit a data access plan that says how data is going to be shared, how customer consent will be acquired, and so on. And so in order for states to start putting together their data access plan, they need to think of, what's available or what's available from their utilities. But even at a higher level, their most suitable pathway is largely going to be dependent on the governing regulations and existing energy data collection infrastructure and capabilities, which really vary from state to state and sometimes from utility to utility within the state. And this really gets back to Cliff's presentation where he talked about kind of the importance or benefits of starting at the state level. But given that diversity, we wanted to provide states with a template for filling out their data access plan and, even taking a step back and thinking about what pathways they have. And most states are going to have to think about multiple pathways because utility policies will vary across the state, making it quite difficult. But here in this decision tree, you could see, the first question is whether or not your state has a law or requirement that utilities must provide billing data to third parties for all or nearly all customers. This refers to the kind of the opt-in or opt-out. Most states at this point are going to follow an opt-in pathway. I think California and New York have open access to energy data where their customers would have to opt out, but most states are going to be in this category on the left, the opt-in pathway. And then this, just like that, those options I gave you, working from kind of easiest, less burdensome to most complicated, this decision tree follows somewhat of that format too. But here you could see, then you work down from the state level to the utility level, and really this decision tree captures kind of those different policy levers that are available too, that really could help program implementation if addressed at the state level, if addressed at the utility level. The time is now to start having these conversations as states and utilities are thinking about what the implementation of their home energy rebate programs will look like, how will these decisions be made, what needs to be in place for effective deployment. So I encourage all of you, to talk to the various stakeholders involved in this process about what will work best for the residents in your state. Next slide. And here, assuming that these slides would be emailed out, I just included the key links here. One, our program requirements document that captures our data access requirements. We dive a bit deeper into those requirements as they relate to the Home Efficiency Rebates program and our utility data access guidelines. And then lastly, where I pulled that decision tree from, and the idea is that states, identify their pathway in that decision tree, and then in that larger document linked here at the bottom of the slide, there's corresponding templates based on the pathway that you're in that will help you fill out the data access plan that is required as part of your application. Next slide. I think that's it. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. All right, our final panelist is Jen Larson from the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Hey everyone, just waiting for my slides to come up here, unless thanks everyone for joining today. Let me share my screen so I can share slides.
Sorry, I'm getting them pulled up. It just took
okay.
me longer. It took me longer than expected. Sorry about that.
No problem. I just wanted to make, I've got
Here we go.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Wonderful. So I'm here to talk to you about HUD's Green and Resilient Retrofit program and the importance that whole building data plays in that program in terms of the properties that are able to participate and the impact to our own data analysis and understanding what is happening in that program and what good that program's accomplishing out there in the world. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'll start by just giving a brief outline of the Green and Resilient Retrofit program. It was funded through the Inflation Reduction Act, and HUD got just about $1 billion to make our portfolio, our assisted housing portfolio, greener and more resilient to natural disasters. And so there's a couple ways that we're doing that. One, we have some loans and grants available to properties. And so we have about 23,000 properties all over the country that receive some level of rental assistance from HUD. So they're intended for very low income participants, and HUD makes up the difference for the rent on those units. So tenants pay 30% of their income, and the rest is subsidized. For those buildings, they're privately owned, and sometimes it's challenging for those owners to put together recapitalization packages to be able to do the amount of improvement work that needs to be done at those properties. So we're able to provide loans and grants under GRRP that allow properties to make these type of improvements to either achieve some kind of high-level green certification, to reduce their energy costs, or to add some green elements to a deal that they're already working on. So those notice of funding opportunities are out on the street. They are taking applications on a rolling basis. There's a couple different cohorts of types of programs, but if you have any assisted properties in your purview that you want to make aware of these opportunities, it's a really exciting chance for HUD to offer some funding to properties to be able to make themselves greener or more resilient to natural disasters. The other piece of funding that HUD was awarded and is able to use as part of the Green and Resilient Retrofit program is the benchmarking initiative. And that's what I'm primarily going to focus on talking about today, because it really, whole building energy data is very critical to that effort. We're offering free energy and water benchmarking services to these properties. As I said, there's 23,000 properties nationwide, and helping them getting signed up for EPA's portfolio manager to be able to document and benchmark what their utility costs are. So they know, potentially if they want to apply for one of these loans or grants, they're going to need to be able to demonstrate what the change in their utilities was from beginning to end of the project, and or if they're just interested in other measures they can take. Maybe they're not ready for one of these loans and grants, but they still want to know what their utility levels are at and what steps they can take to lower them. So the implementation of both of these programs really require whole building energy data for owners of apartment buildings, multifamily buildings, to be able to understand, what where the weak points are in their utility usage, control what they can in terms of what they're able to control, if they have individual utility users in their units, or if they have a whole building boiler or something like that. Every building is set up a little bit differently, and so it's really important for owners to have that visibility into the utility usage at that property in order to be able to make meaningful improvements. And our email address is down there on the last line. I think it will be again at the end, but if you have questions about the benchmarking program, it's mfbenchmarking@hud.gov is the email address there at the bottom. We can go to the next slide. As I talked about, the GRRP loans and grants, part of the what we want to do with these long term is to be able to see what the impact of this funding was. So properties that are signing up for the loans and grants are doing initial benchmarking, pre-rehab benchmarking, and then as they make their improvements, and then they're continuing to monitor utility usage, although sometimes during construction it can get a little bit off of the norm, but they want to be able to monitor utility usage through construction. And then post construction, we want to understand, looking at the initial data and the finalized data, what has changed, how much utility savings have there been at this particular property, and then what kind of impact did this funding have, both on utility spending and HUD's assistance dollar, because we're obviously providing some funding towards these buildings, and to the extent they need less money for utilities, we're able to potentially reduce the amount that we're spending, but also in terms of the environmental benefit from the reduction in utilities. that tenants are seeing. So, it's really important for owners to be able to have access to whole building data to participate in these programs and other programs through the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's really a key. There are a few states that already have access to whole building data accessibility. So that's wonderful. And we were hoping to encourage more as time goes on. So you can go to the next slide. The next slide is just a map of where our units are located. So I mentioned 23,000 properties all over the country. We have about 1.4 million HUD-assisted units that are eligible for funding. So in terms of the benchmarking assistance that's available, all of these properties are eligible. We have the support to be able to sign up all of these units if they so choose. We are working with our contractor to continue outreach, work with a certain number of properties at a time, phasing outreach over the next few years to be able to reach as many properties as we can. But we're certainly getting input from properties now as well that want to be early adopters because they're excited about the potential for applying for some of this rehab funding that I mentioned. So, as you can see, there are thousands of units, 1.4 million units across the country. Take a look at where you're located and see how many units there are, but there's a lot of potential for this type of funding. You can go to the next slide. So in terms of where we're at right now with GRRP, I mentioned those notices of funding opportunities for the loans and grants are out on the street. We have already awarded $295 million in loans and grants for 74 properties in 24 different states. So that's a lot of properties that are going to be making some pretty amazing improvements to benefit the residents there and HUD's budget in terms of the assistance money that we're sending, and they'll be consuming less utilities in the long run. We have $655 million yet to award. Those are being awarded on a rolling basis. So every month there's a different type of funding available. There's 3 different kind of cohorts, as I mentioned. One is intended to add some green elements to an existing deal. The second one is intended to work with properties that are really interested in reaching net zero. So it's net zero energy usage. So, they're achieving a really ambitious green certification. And then the last cohort is for properties that are particularly at risk of climate change events or have a lot of energy needs at their property that are the most needy in terms of energy usage. So those are the comprehensive awards. And there we have a contractor who we've engaged to work with properties. So, the business of affordable housing, I don't know how many of you are familiar, but it's a very complicated endeavor to be able to put a deal together and get to the point where you're ready to break ground and make those improvements. And so the comprehensive award includes some support for owners who may not have done a type of deal like this before, who don't understand, the different funding sources that might be available, and helping them build something that will take advantage of existing funding sources and leverage the GRRP funds to create a whole building renovation that will really impact the utility usage and the renewability and resiliency of that property. In addition, we had just launched before, I think right around Thanksgiving, launched the benchmarking program in our first cohort of outreach. So we have 274 properties that have signed up so far. We are continuing to do outreach through our whole portfolio on a rolling basis. Additional funding additional groups of properties are receiving outreach every couple of weeks. We have a multi-year contract with an Energy Star professional firm to be able to train the property staff, help them complete the initial benchmarking in EPA Portfolio Manager, and then work with the property on an ongoing basis to make sure they're able to continue that benchmarking, continue receiving that utility data, and get things, keep things rolling. We also will be identifying, areas of energy and water usage that are particularly out of line with the area, or look like they could potentially be problems, and offer some suggestions on steps that owners can take to improve their utility bills. Next slide. So we recently issued a joint letter with DOE and EPA encouraging the availability of whole building utility data access. It's really important for us to be able to have our owners have the visibility into utility services to make these kinds of decisions about their properties, and make sure that we're helping them be able to reduce their utility usage and be informed about their properties. So wanted to let you know about that joint letter. And then I think the last slide is just our contact information. So in terms of GRRP loans or grants, there's a huge amount of information at HUD.gov/GRRP about both of the programs. But if you're interested in either one of those, any of those loans or grants, or affordable properties that could benefit from those loans or grants, as I said, it's just properties that receive HUD property-based assistance. So it is those specific properties, but I encourage you to look at HUD.gov/GRRP. There is grrp@HUD.gov. It's an email address set up to answer questions if you have any about the loans and grants piece of the GRRP. And then as far as benchmarking, we have our own website, or you can receive it, or you can get to it through the GRRP site. We have our email address, as I mentioned, mfbenchmarking@HUD.gov. And then we have a newsletter that you can sign up for. There's a link there in the presentation. So that is the summary of the benchmarking program. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today and to talk to you all, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you to all of our panelists for their presentations. I believe we have the rest of our time here to take questions. We have some pre-prepared questions for our panelists, but of course always prefer to hear questions from attendees. So if you do have questions for any of our panelists, please feel free to put those in the chat. I also think you can utilize the raising hand function if you just want to come off of mute and ask. But while folks are potentially adding those questions into the chat, I can just kick us off with some questions. And I think we'll start with Lauren, because I believe you needed to jump the soonest. So what can states do right now to make sure that their multifamily building owners are ready for rebates, and how can they work with utilities to make sure that that data is available?
Sure. So I think number one is to get in front of their utilities, to build those relationships, and to think about, lay out their program design strategy from home energy rebates. How can utilities be partners? And I mean that both informally and formally in the deployment. And, think and discuss with them, one, practically, how are they delivering this data to customers now, or how are they not? Are there IT solutions in place that could help this? I think it's like figuring out what the goals are on behalf of the state, communicating that to utilities, and seeing if they could find some solution. I'm sure that there's probably a lot of states that tell me that that would not work, but it's definitely the place to start. And the same thing with utility commissions too, right? I mean, I think this is a lot of money. Everyone wants to see these rebates be effective. And so, bringing as many along as possible. I also think it would be helpful to involve the multifamily community in these discussions. How do they need the data delivered? What's most helpful? And help build the case. Rebates are a significant kind of injection of funding into the state economy, but they will expire. So I think it's important to bring along the multifamily building community, the rental associations and such in there, and to really build the use case beyond just the rebates of why these data access pathways are so critical. So yeah, building kind of that momentum across the state, but really getting rolling up your sleeves and having those hard conversations with the states and regulators to try to find some best case solution, some middle ground, at least moving in that direction.
Thank you, Lauren. All right, a question for Cliff, which I'm also going to use as an opportunity to piggyback and talk a little bit about a DC specific funding opportunity, which is if you can just talk a little bit more about why building owners want and need this utility data, and specifically how this new federal funding is only accessible with this data. We obviously heard from some of our panelists about some of the specific programs. But I will mention that here in DC, in fiscal year 2022 and 2023, each of those respective years, we received around $30 million in funding each year through ARPA to provide energy audits, retrofits, low-cost construction loans to affordable housing buildings that did not meet our building energy performance standards. And while there were a number of eligibility criteria, one of the most basic ones was that these buildings were determined to not meet the BEPS based on their 2019 data. And that could only be determined to see if they had a score less than our standard, which is a 66, if they were reporting whole building energy data. And so we identified a whole bunch of buildings that might be eligible, but at the end of the day, the funding was only available to those who could demonstrate their eligibility in terms of actually performing below the standard based on that whole building energy data. So that's one example in which having aggregate whole building utility data was absolutely crucial in order for these affordable housing projects to tap into millions of dollars in funding to help them meet our building energy performance standards. So yeah, if you could speak a bit more about why this is so important.
Yes, thank you, Joanna, and thanks for sharing that. I think DC's provided a great example. We certainly want to see resources being targeted first priority to frontline communities who've been hurt first and worst by climate change, and that certainly includes affordable housing. So really happy that DC and other states are investing resources to improve the performance of affordable housing and help reduce their greenhouse gas footprints. This data is needed. I think Lauren did a great job of talking about what why you need the data for some of the DOE programs, and there's many billions of dollars available there. And Jen did a great job of talking about some of the money available from HUD. Brendan mentioned the Section 179D tax deduction, which provides up to $5 per square foot deduction for commercial buildings, and that includes multifamily buildings. And you need access to that data. You need to reduce your energy use. Your measured energy use is the easiest way to qualify for existing buildings, and so you have to have whole building energy data. But fundamentally, you can't manage what you don't measure, and we need to understand how much energy our buildings are using and how much greenhouse gas emissions they're emitting. And that's, any sort of climate plan is going to rely on that. And in most states, buildings are the largest or the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And large buildings are the easiest first place to start. And you need access to whole building energy data to really have a comprehensive strategy there. And the building owners want it. They want it so they can qualify for these incentives. They want it so that they can target their own performance. If I'm a owner of 20 buildings, I'd like to know which ones are performing best and where I should start with my own investments. And also they need it because they're required to disclose it under various new laws. There's a pending rule from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission that, once finalized, will require that building owners disclose climate liability. That's both their physical risk of climate damage and the risk of transition risk, which includes things like building performance standards. And it also will require that they disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, their whole building greenhouse gas emissions. So it's going to be incumbent on building owners to have access to this data once that law is finalized. And but for big building owners that also have operations in places like the European Union and California, there's a new law that just went into effect in the European Union on January 1st. And it requires that people with operations in Europe and over $1 billion in revenue, they have to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions globally, not just their European emissions, but their emissions around the world. So already there are companies that are having to report for this reason. And even if there are no legal requirements, the fact is that there are many trillions of dollars of assets under management that are now telling their portfolio companies, you must report this. And they've been doing this for a long time. The private sector is ahead of the public sector in this regard. So, building owners need this data. It's a huge headache for them to try and get it. And having laws like the Utility Data Access Law on the book helps the building owners. It helps the utilities by providing them a safe harbor, protecting them from liability and giving them clear rules of the road, and putting the right entity in charge, which is usually going to be the utility commission. And unfortunately, most utility commissions don't even recognize that this is a problem. They don't even recognize that whole building data is something that building owners need. And that's one of the places where energy offices could come in could do a lot of work in helping to educate their peer agencies. I should mention also, California has a law which passed that will also require utility data globally for companies with over $1 billion, or in some cases over $500 million of revenue and operations in California. And that law will go into effect in a couple of years. So this is data that building owners have been scrambling to try and get for a long time. Some of them have sort of cobbled it together. But in many cases, it's just a huge thorn in their side. And that's why they're so eager to get these laws passed. And if you want to try and help get one of these laws passed in your state, I want to help connect you with the local BOMA chapter, that's the building owners and others who are eager to make this happen.
Thanks, Cliff, and great pitch there. I'll also, just another reminder, if you have any questions, please be bold, put it in the chat. You can come off of mute. Certainly want to take advantage of all these great folks that we have on this panel. Question for Jen, mostly clarifying question as to which properties are eligible for the benchmarking initiative and if there is a deadline for registering for that initiative.
Sure. So any property that receives property-based assistance from HUD is eligible. Those are, usually under our Section 8 program, our 202 program, which is housing for seniors, or 811, which is housing for persons with disabilities. I can put a link to the chat into a listing of properties that are eligible generally. So there's, it's a big list, but if you are interested and want to poke around and look by state to see which properties in your state are eligible, that's great. We are going to be doing continued outreach, as I mentioned, to the Hill portfolio, but properties can sign up at any time. We don't, I think the IRA funding needs to be spent by 2028. So, but we have certainly these services ongoing for quite a while. So at whatever point an owner is ready to begin benchmarking, we want to be here to help them.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jen. Okay, we've got a question from Michael, which is if multifamily owners can't get whole building data either for DOE rebates or HUD grants and loans, or what if these owners can't get whole building data either for DOE rebates or HUD grants and loans? Are they out of luck, or is some kind of sampling allowed in these cases. I think we lost Lauren, so I'm not sure if we'll be able to speak to the DOE rebates portion, but Jen, if you want to speak to the HUD port.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, HUD does have some workarounds to be able to allow folks to apply for funding if they have not been able to benchmark. But I think we are requiring that at some point, when the project is complete, that the property is able to benchmark. So, I think we're willing to work with properties in their situation. We know that some are having an easier time than others. We don't want anyone to be disadvantaged by that. So there are workarounds to be able to apply. At some point from receiving that funding, folks are obligated to benchmark.
Thanks, Jen.
And I just put a link in the chat to HUD's public data and the assistance in Section 8 database. So all of the project-based assistance that's there.
Ed, I think those are all of the questions that we had. Certainly, we've got 12 minutes left on our time, so want to make sure that if there are any lingering questions, we get to them. But
I was just taking a look. Yeah, no, I mean, I think this has been really great. I'll just make one last pitch. If folks have questions, then please do raise your hand, jump in. Otherwise, if we don't see any requests to question now, I think we'll probably wrap it up. I would encourage people to think about how data access can fit into your climate planning reduction grant plans that are going to be due very soon. I hope that this webinar has helped make clear why that might be useful and why that might be something that would fit into those plans. But I want to thank all of you, Joanna, Jen, Cliff, Brendan, and Lauren, who's left. But thank you all for joining us and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise. Really appreciate it. It's been really great. And I'll double check with all my speakers before I commit to sending out the slides. I want to make sure that's okay with them. But I think we'll be able to do that, and we'll get that posted online, and we'll have the recording up later on. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon. Stay warm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.